All right, guys, so let's update our create post path operation function so that we can uh, retrieve the title and the content from our front end and then create a brand new post and store it within our my posts array. So how do we do that? Well, we already know that we can retrieve our post by referencing this post variable, because this will take our schema, which remember we defined with Pydantic. It's going to do all the validation and it's going to store it within post. And so this is still going to be a Pydantic model. However, our array is going to be an array of dictionaries. So we have to convert that to dictionaries. And we already know that we can convert any Pydantic model to a dictionary by doing .dict. And then that'll turn it into a standard Python dictionary. And at that point, it's pretty simple. This is just standard Python at this point. We can just do a my_posts.append. And then we can append post.dict, just like we did before. We can remove these print statements. They're just cluttering things up. However, there's one little issue. Like I said, we need to have an ID for every entry. And normally the database handles that, but since we're not actually working with a real database, we're going to have to do this in software. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to assign it a random integer. Not really that reliable, but if we pick a random number between 1 and 10 million, the odds of us hitting the same number twice is almost next to none. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the random package. So we'll say from random import ranrange, and this is what we're going to use to create a random number or a random integer. And so instead of doing this, I'm actually going to remove this for a second. And I spelled append wrong as well. What we're going to do is I'm going to say post_dict, which is going to be the post Pydantic model converted to a dictionary. I'm going to set that equal to post.dict. Okay, so this is going to be the dictionary. And so now that we have a regular Python dictionary, what we can say is post_dict. And then I'm going to reference the ID field that I'm creating. And I'm going to assign that to be a random number. So we're going to give it a range of 0 to, and then just pick some really, 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 really large number. So this is going to ensure that pretty much any entry for development purposes is going to be unique. We'll append that to the array. And then here's the thing, when it comes to how a usual API works is that when a front end sends the data to create a new post, after we create the post stored in our database, we should send back the newly created post, including the brand new ID. So let's send that back. So in this case, I'm going to send back post_dict, because that's going to be the brand new post that we add to the add to our posts array. So let's try this out. Let's go to our post request that we have. And let's see all of our data. So we've got a couple of things: title, content, rating. I don't really care about the rating. But I'll just leave it in there for now. It shouldn't matter. And then we'll just hit send and let's see what happens. And it looks like we got an error, so let's see what happened. All right, it looks like there's and I already see what happened. I forgot to actually include post_dict. We actually have to pass in what we want to append to the array. Let's save that. Try this again. Hopefully no errors. Look at that, guys. So it looks like we got back the newly created entry, and we can see that it has an ID of whatever that number is. And if we do a GET request now to retrieve all of our posts, we should see that newly created entry. So let's take a look. So we've got post 1, post 2, and then we've got that brand new post. Look at that, guys. So we are a little bit less than halfway done with creating our CRUD-based application. Now, before moving any further and writing any more code, what I want to do is I want to actually save these requests, because right now they're just kind of stored in memory. If we close out Postman, it'll still remember it, but what we can do is we can create a collection. So here I'm going to select create collection, and I'm going to give this a name. So I'm just going to name this after my project. So I can call this, Fast API course, or, since this is a social media app, we can call it whatever we would call it. I'm just going to call it Fast API course. We'll save that. And then what I want to do is I want to save these two requests so that I don't have to remember this in case they accidentally get deleted. So I'll hit save as. We'll save it, and then you can give it any name. So this is going to be, I forget, this is the GET request. So I'm going to call this GET posts. I'm going to store it inside this collection. right? And so now within this collection, you can see this request is stored in there. And I'm going to do the same thing for the post request. So this is for creating posts. We'll do save as again. I'm going to say create post. And then it's already remembers the most recent collection, but go ahead and select the collection if it didn't remember that. And then we'll hit save. And so now they're both saved in here, and we can easily bring these up anytime, even if we close out all of our requests. So I closed everything out. I can bring that right back up. It's going to remember everything. And then it's the same thing with the post request. If I go to the body, it even remembers the fields. So Postman, one of my favorite tools when it comes to working with APIs. And, you know, as this course goes along, you're going to continue to learn more and more things about Postman. Okay, guys, let's continue building out our CRUD application. The next function I want to implement is retrieving one individual post. And so let's define a function for that. So here I'll call this get post. Keep in mind that this is singular. So I call this get post, whereas to retrieve all posts, it's get posts. But like I said, the name of these functions don't actually matter. It's just more for you, more for readability. And the decorator is going to look like this. And so this is based off of that slide I already showed you. So it's going to be a get method. And then here, the URL is going to be /posts ID, right? Because the user is going to provide us the ID of the specific post that they're interested in. And so that's going to get embedded in the URL. So they'll send a GET request to /post/ and then whatever ID. So if they want to see the information for post 1, they'll pass in a value of 1. And what this is actually referred to, the proper terminology for this is that this is called a path parameter. So this ID field represents a path parameter, and this parameter happens to represent the ID of a specific post the user is interested in seeing. And so what we can do is FastAPI will automatically extract this ID, and then we can pass it right into our function. So now our function has access to whatever value was in that URL right there. And so if we want to, I can do a quick print of ID, and then we'll just return some hard-coded data. So I'll just say data. Actually, we'll call this, how about post_detail. I'll say this is the post you're interested in. Or even better, what I can do is we'll change this to an F string, and I'll just say, here is post, and then we can just pass an ID. So let's save that. We'll go to Postman, and what we want to do is we want to create a new post, but let's create it in our collection. So I'm going to go in there, select add request, give it whatever name you want. I'll say get one post. And then for the URL, just copy the get posts URL. And then we want to pass in the ID that we're interested in. So we just do /, and then in this case, I'm going to get the post with an ID of 2. And the reason why I'm doing that is because we've hard-coded one of our posts to have an ID of 2, so I know that's always going to be there. And then we could just try sending this and see what happens. So it says post detail, here is post, and then post number 2. So it looks like we were successfully able to extract the ID, the path parameter that was passed into the specific URL that the user sent a request to. So we now have access to that. At that point, we can just find whichever entry in my post has that specific ID. Now we have to implement the logic for actually getting that post. And so there's many different ways of doing this. And I'm telling you right now, this is probably not the best way of doing this. I'm not really even a Python expert. I'm sure there's much better ways of grabbing this information. However, keep in mind the code's going to be changed later on once we start working with the database. So this at this point is just basic Python logic. And I do want you guys to keep in mind that this may not be best practice for the best way of retrieving an individual post. But I'm just going to create a simple function, and it's going to be called find post. So this is how you find a post by an ID. So we'll pass in an ID in this function to retrieve the post. And what we'll do is we'll iterate over the my post. So we'll say for p in my posts, and we'll say if p, so p represents the specific post that we're iterating over. So if this specific post has an ID, which equals the ID that was passed into the function, then we'll return p. We'll return that specific post. And then at this point, we can call this function. So I'm going to remove that print statement and say post equals find_post ID. And then for this, we can just remove this and just return post. So let's save this. Let's go back to Postman. and let's try this out. And it looks like I got an error. So something happened. And let's actually take a look at our code. Well, guys, I think I found the issue. So the reason why we keep getting none, right? If I keep hitting send, it says none. And what I did was I just printed out the post to see what we got. And it actually just prints out none. So for some reason, we're unable to find post. And I think I know exactly why. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a print of ID again. And this is going to teach us an important lesson. So I'm going to send another request. And it prints out 2. However, what we're going to do is I'm actually going to get the type of ID. So I forget how to do that. I think it's the type. I think I could just do type in Python. So I'm going to figure out what is the actual type of ID. And now if I send this request again, right, you could see that the type is actually a string and not an integer. And so when we pass this check-in where we say if p ID, so if we get the ID field and compare it to the ID that we pass in, it's never going to equal that because one's an integer, the other one's a string. They're never going to be equal. So the first thing that we actually have to do is before we call this function, we have to convert it to an integer. So I can just say int. That's going to convert it to an int. Save that. And then at this point, if I send this, it should now work. Look at that. So keep in mind, guys, anytime we have a path parameter, it's always going to be returned as a string, even if it represents an integer or a number. We always have to manually convert it ourselves. So don't forget to do that. Now, there is one little issue with what we're doing. So everything's working. And if I actually change this to a 1, we should get a different post. So everything's working great. However, what happens if I type this? Well, let's hit send. Well, we get an error, right? Because we're trying to convert this to an int and it's going to throw an error. And then instead of sending back a nice, built-in response, we just get an internal server error and the user has no idea what exactly is wrong. So we want to provide it feedback. So how can we perform some kind of validation to ensure that whatever data that's passed into this path parameter can actually be properly converted to an integer? Well, we can perform validation with FastAPI. So here for ID, what we can do is we can say, I want this to be an integer. So what it's going to do is it's first of all going to validate that it can be converted to an integer, and then it'll automatically convert it to an integer for us. So we no longer have to convert this ourselves. So here I could just pass an ID because this will make sure that it's already converted. And so now if I save this and I change this back to a number first, let's make sure that everything's working. So it automatically converted it to an integer. And now if I pass in, a string, it's now going to throw an error. It's going to say for a path parameter of ID, you can see that this value is not a valid integer. And so now the front end has a good way of understanding what they did wrong. And, this can be anything, right? So if you wanted this to be a string, right, we can have this automatically get validated as a string and convert it into a string so that if they do actually send a string, no errors, right? And then if they try to, actually, even if you put in a number, it's not going to throw an error because any number can actually be converted into a string. But we want an integer, so I'm going to change this back to an integer. And then we'll just hardcode this as 2. Perfect. Make sure you save your request. And so now we've implemented our third function within our CRUD app. So we've just got 2 more. We got to handle updating and deleting posts. But we've got getting all posts, creating a post, and then getting an individual post. And you'll see that for the last 2, it's pretty much the same thing, right? We just have to define our specific decorator and then define the logic for actually creating and deleting a post from that array or updating a post as well. Now, before we move on, I do want to show you guys one potential issue that you can run into if you don't quite understand how these routes work and how order matters within FastAPI. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a dummy route, and you guys don't need to follow along on this. It's just a quick little demonstration. And I'm just going to make this another GET request or handler for a GET request. And then this one's going to be posts/latest. So what this will do is when the user sends a GET request to this specific path, latest path, we're going to grab whatever the latest post is. And so here I'll just say def get latest post. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to reference our my posts list, and I'll say we'll get the length of my post. and then we'll just -1. So this will grab the latest post. And then what we're going to do is just return that. Here we'll say detail, and then we'll pass in, and actually let me store this in a variable, post equals, and then we'll return post. We'll save this, and I'm going to show you what happens. So let's create a new request. I'm going to just copy the URL from the previous one. Then here we're going to change this to latest. Let's see what happens. Interesting. We get an error. So what exactly happened? Well, let's take a look at the error. It's saying that we have a path parameter called ID, and it looks like it's saying that this is not a valid integer. So I'm not even sure why it's referencing this error, because if we take a look at our code, right, there's no path parameter here. So what is exactly happening? Well, let's take a look, right? Our request looks like this. So it's going to /post/latest. So when we send this request, what's going to happen is that we're going to start all the way at the top, and Fast API is going to go through the list of all of our paths, and it's going to find the first match. So we have one at just the root URL, so it's not going to match that. We have one at /posts. It's once again not going to match that. This one is for a post request, so it's not going to match that because we sent a GET request. But then something interesting happens here when we get to this GET request. Right? So this handles a GET request, and then it matches /posts, and then some variable. So technically, that variable could be latest. You see the issue that we're running into? Because there's no way for Fast API to know that that route was meant for, that request was meant for this specific path, right? Because it does technically match on this. And then what happens is, since it matches on this route, it then tries to perform validation on ID, which is, in this case, it's going to end up being latest. And then it's going to throw an error because latest can't be converted to an integer. And so this is the example of where order matters. So you have to be careful when you structure your API, especially with your paths and your URLs. You want to make sure that you don't run into this type of issue. So, one thing in this case you could do is just move this up. That would fix the issue, because now if you save this and then run this, right, it works. And if you try to reference a specific ID, that's going to work as well. Well, in that case, let's try 1. Yep. And so that works as well, because /post/1 will never match this one. It'll only match this one. So be very careful when it comes to the order. It always works top down. So anytime you're working with path parameters, it could potentially result in you guys accidentally matching other routes by accident. So, there's different ways to get around this. Like I said, you can just move this up, or if you wanted to change the URL altogether so that this is like a /post/ I don't know, just put in another keyword, something like a recent or something, recent/latest or something. Well, actually, even then that would, yeah. And so I just want to make sure you keep that in mind when you're structuring your API, because anytime you have a path parameter, it could result in you accidentally matching requests that were meant for a different route. So I'm just going to delete this. This was merely just for demonstration purposes, and I just want to make sure that you guys understand that Fast API just looks at all of your paths and just works its way down the list till it finds the first match. For our get post path operation, specifically the one where we retrieve one specific post, we do run into a little bit of an issue. So if we go to our Postman real quick and send a request to get one post, but in this case, instead of doing 1 or 2, what I want to do is I want you to put in the ID, put in an ID that doesn't exist. So we only have right now posts with an ID of 1 and 2. What happens if we send it with a ID of 5? You can see what we get back. It says null, right? And I don't like that, because it doesn't really give the front end any feedback as to what exactly is happening. So they don't actually know, they don't know if some kind of error occurred, or if we were unable to retrieve this information properly, or if there's a server error, or if this item doesn't ultimately exist. And so we need a way to accurately tell the front end that, hey, the ID that you're searching for does not actually exist in our database. And the best way to do that is through a method that I'm sure you guys are already a little bit familiar with. So right here, I've got my GitHub page for our course. And you can see it's just GitHub, my username, and then the name of the repo. But if I put in a whole bunch of letters afterward, what's going to happen is GitHub is going to look for a repo with this name that doesn't exist. And let's see what happens. it gets a 404. And I'm sure you guys have seen a 404 error at least once before in your life. So that's a specific HTTP status code that represents that this item was not found, that it does not exist. And HTTP status codes are important. We haven't really talked about it in this course up to this point, but there's a lot of different status codes. And if you actually just search for HTTP status code, you can just grab one of the top links. I'm going to go take a look at the Mozilla one, and you'll see all of the different HTTP status codes, and you'll see when to use them. Now, most of the time, you're going to see that we get a 200 response back. That's the default one the Fast API sends. That usually means that everything's good, everything worked. That's why it says okay. However, we do have other ones that we do also commonly use. So anytime you create something, so within your CRUD application for create, anytime you send a post request, usually after you create that entity, you send a 201 back instead of a traditional 200. So there's a lot of HTTP status codes, and we're going to cover all of those in future lectures. But the ones we're interested in is for when we have an error. So if we scroll down, 400 usually means there's some kind of bad error, something happened. And most importantly, we want the 404 not found. So the server cannot find the requested resource. So that's exactly what we're looking for. Keep in mind, there's also 500 status codes, which means, some kind of server error or server failure. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go back to our code. And what we need to do is we need to manipulate the response, because right now we're getting a 200 back. We're getting a status code of 200. If I send it, it says null, and then it just sends 200. So that doesn't really give us a good idea as to what's happening. So how do we manipulate the response? Well, we have to, first of all, import the response from Fast API. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to pass it in as a parameter into our path operation function. So I'll just call this, I'll store it in a variable called response. And so once you get access to the response object, we can tweak it however we want. So what I'm going to do is, after we search for post, if we didn't find a post, I'm just going to do a quick check. I'm going to say if not post, right? That means if we didn't find a post, what we're going to do is we're going to set the response, and then we're going to grab a property off a response called status code. So here we can tweak the status code of the response. I'm going to say, hey, I want this to be a 404. All right, now let's save it. Now, if I hit send, it still says post detail none, but take a look at the status code. It's now updated to 404. And if I change this to an ID that does exist, right, we get the post properly, and the status code changes to 200, which means everything is good. So that's one way of doing it. However, there's a slightly better way of doing it. Same concept, but instead of hard coding the value or trying to remember it, what we can do is we can import from the Fast API library something called status. And so now instead of having to remember what to use, we could just type in status, and then it's going to show you all of the different HTTP codes. And so now you could just quickly just look through whichever one sounds the most accurate. So we'll grab the 404. And now you don't need to worry about putting hard coding in a number. We can just reference, I guess it's probably an enumerator, but I'm not really sure. So it doesn't really matter. And then that's all you have to do. So let's test this out again. So 200 good, change this to 5, 404 perfect. But the next thing I want to do is I don't want to return null. That looks ugly. So instead, I'd like to actually throw an error. So in this case, in this if statement, I'm just going to call a return that only is going to ever run if post doesn't exist. And we'll just say, in this case, detail, or we'll say message. I'll just say message. F string, and we'll say post with ID. And then we'll pass in what was the ID. And we'll say was not found. All right. And now if we try this, look at that. We get our error, post with ID was not found. And that matches up with the ID that we gave it. And we got our 404. Now this is one solution. However, I think this is a little bit sloppy, and there's a better way of doing it. Instead, what we can do is we can raise an HTTP exception. So this is a built-in exception into Fast API that'll automatically, you can pass in what the specific error code you want as well as the message. And so that way you don't have to hard code all of this. And it just makes everything look a lot simpler. So we'll go to the Fast API up here, and we're going to import something called HTTP exception. And now we can delete all of this nonsense code. Actually, I'm just going to comment it for now, just so I can reference it in a second. And all we have to say is we'll raise an exception. So we raise HTTP exception. And then we have to pass in two things. So first is the status code. So we'll set the status code to be status dot, and then same thing, right? So far, nothing's really changed. And then here, we'll just pass in the value for detail, which is going to be the message that Fast API automatically responds back with. And I'm going to pass in the same exact F string. And so now we've basically replaced this with just this one line right here, this HTTP exception. I think this looks a little bit nicer. I don't like having to do the set the response and then having to pass in. I don't like having to pass in the response into the path operation function, having to set a property, and then having to return my message. We can remove all of this nonsense. And I can get rid of all of these comments. And I think this is just a little bit cleaner. And moving forward, we're going to be using these HTTP exceptions a lot, because all we have to do is just pass in what's the HTTP status code and then the message we want to send back to the user. And then that's what's going to be sent to them. So now, once again, we're going to try this out. And look at that, right? So we got the 404 and we got the message, the detailed message, right? A lot cleaner, a lot simpler. Now, before we move any further and before we wrap up this video, I did mention that anytime we create something, we should send back a 201. So if we go back to our create post, and then we'll just create a new post again, we can just send this. We created a new post. Look at the status code that gets sent back. It gets sent back at 200. And that is wrong. Remember, anytime we create an entity based off of that documentation, we should send a 201. So how exactly do we how do we change what the default status code is for a specific path operation? Well, what we can do is we'll go back to our code and let's find our create post. And if you want to change the default status code, what we do is inside the decorator, we'll pass in another option. So we'll say status code here, and then we set this to be status, and then whatever our specific status code is. So I want 201, and then that's all you have to do. So now, by default, anytime someone sends a request to create posts, we're going to send a 201 created. So we'll save that. We'll give it another shot. If I try this again, now we get a 201. Perfect. So at this point, I think you guys will have a solid understanding of how to change status codes, whether it's because we're trying to throw an exception or if we want to just change the default status code of a specific path operation. All right, guys. So now it's time to move on to deleting a post. So to delete a post, remember, we're going to start off with our decorator, and it's going to request, or